I came across this article a couple weeks back and I thought I'd make a video on it as it shows exactly the sort of totalitarianism, that is, government inserting itself directly over the control of its citizens' lives, that we're seeing arise out of the COVID-19 hysteria. Published by the Washington Post, it's titled, "A Doctor Derided Mask Wearing. His Medical License Has Been Suspended." The article starts off, deriding mask wearing, Stephen LaTulippe has touted his credentials as a, quote, practicing physician. Last month, he urged Trump supporters gathered in Salem, Oregon to, quote, take off the mask of shame, though hardly a covered face was in sight, and said proudly to claps and cheers that none of his clinic staff wore the simple accessories shown to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Now, before I go on, I might as well take the time to explain the actual scientific consensus for mask use, as opposed to the Washington Post linking to itself as an example of, quote, factual reporting. First, the New England Medical Journal stated in an article titled, "Universal Masking in Hospitals in the COVID-19 Era," stated, quote, "A mask will not protect providers caring for a patient with active COVID-19 if it is not accompanied by meticulous hand hygiene, eye protection, gloves, and a gown. A mask alone will not prevent healthcare workers with early COVID-19 from contaminating their hands and spreading the virus to patients and colleagues. Focusing on universal masking alone may paradoxically lead to more transmission of COVID-19 if it diverts attention from implementing more fundamental infection control measures. So the push for mask use as a huge portion of preventative measures against COVID-19 while deprioritizing other methods of hygiene has actually ensured the spread of COVID-19 continues at a higher rate. Second, an article published to the NIH entitled "The Use of Masks and Respirators to Prevent Transmission of Influenza, a Systematic Review of the Scientific Evidence," states in its conclusion, quote, "In conclusion, there is a limited evidence base to support the use of masks and or respirators in healthcare community settings. Mask use is best undertaken as part of a package of personal protection, especially including hand hygiene in both home and healthcare settings. Early initiation and correct consistent wearing of masks/respirators may improve their effectiveness. However, this remains a major challenge in both the context of a formal study and in everyday practice." This is yet another piece of research showing the lack of significant evidence and data needed to push the nationwide or statewide mask mandates. Furthermore, it shows a stark need for further measures to be taken by not only healthcare workers but everyone involved if stopping the spread of the virus is really the goal. Again, just as the first article went on to state, mask use alone is not enough. And this article even furthers this point by stating that improper mask use may actually provide no benefit at all in terms of slowing or stopping the spread. Third, another NIH published article entitled "Use of Surgical Face Masks to Reduce the Incidence of the Common Cold Among Healthcare Workers in Japan, a Randomized Controlled Trial," states, quote, "Face mask use in healthcare workers has not been demonstrated to provide benefit in terms of cold symptoms or getting colds. A larger study is needed to definitively establish non-inferiority of no mask use. Even against the most common coronavirus, the common cold, face mask use did not provide benefit, and further data is needed to contribute to such a mandated motion." Fourth, an AARQ published article entitled "Comparison of Filtration Efficiency and Pressure Drop in Anti-Yellow Sand Masks, Quarantine Masks, Medical Masks, General Masks, and Handkerchiefs" states, quote, "The penetration values of most medical masks were over 20%. Medical masks show no significant difference in penetration and pressure drop between inward tests and outward tests. General masks and handkerchiefs have no protection function in terms of the aerosol filtration efficiency. No significant difference in penetration was noted between the KFDA and NIOSH protocols, but the pressure drop using the KFDA protocol was significantly lower than that using the NIOSH protocol. The government needs to prepare exact guidelines for mask use by citizens to avoid the inhalation of external harmful substances." This shows us more proof that solely focusing on mask use actually harms the public's general health, as other measures are necessary to be taken. As well as that, Probably the most important piece of information states that cloth masks and handkerchiefs are entirely ineffective. When you go to your local business and you're forced to put that rag on your face, just know that it is doing absolutely nothing to stop the spread of the virus. The only thing that you get out of it is your virtue being signaled to the rest of the world that you're, quote, doing the right thing, even if that thing isn't actually doing anything of benefit at all. Fifth, an article published to medRxiv entitled Face Masks and Similar Barriers to Prevent Respiratory Illness Such as COVID-19, a Rapid Systematic Review, states, quote, the evidence is not sufficiently strong to support widespread use of face masks as a protective measure against COVID-19. However, there is enough evidence to support the use of face masks for short periods of time by particularly vulnerable individuals when in transient higher risk situations. Further high-quality trials are needed to assess when wearing a face mask in the community is most likely to be protective. Even with presented data showing the use of masks may have a beneficial effect, there is still not sufficient data to prove that mandating masks en masse is the right step to take. 6. Another article published to medRxiv entitled Physical Interventions to Interrupt or Reduce the Spread of Respiratory Viruses, Part 1, Face Masks, Eye Protection, and Person Distancing, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, states, quote, most included trials had poor design, reporting, and sparse events. There was insufficient evidence to provide a recommendation on the use of facial barriers without other measures. We found insufficient evidence for a difference between surgical masks and N95 respirators and limited evidence to support effectiveness of quarantine. This systematic review even touched on the issues presented with quarantine, as well as the fact that mandatory face mask use holds insufficient data on its efficacy and should not be blindly pushed as an end-all be-all. Even regardless of one's own opinion on mask use as a whole, the entire scientific community 100% agrees that solely focusing on face masks as the preventative measure one must take to stop the spread of COVID-19 is ineffective at best and harmful as a whole at worst. 7th, and I'd argue the most important study on masks to date, published to the NIH entitled A Cluster Randomized Trial of Cloth Masks Compared with Medical Masks in Healthcare Workers, it states, quote, the rates of all infection outcomes were highest in the cloth mask arm, with the rates of influenza-like illness statistically significantly higher in the cloth mask arm compared with the medical mask arm. Cloth masks also had significantly higher rates of influenza-like illness compared with the control arm. Furthering in its conclusion, quote, this study is the first random controlled trial of cloth masks, and the results caution against the use of cloth masks. This is an important finding to inform occupational health and safety. Moisture retention, reuse of cloth masks, and poor filtration may result in an increased risk of infection. Increased risk from the use of cloth masks. Not only, as we noted earlier and as this study notes, cloth masks are not effective whatsoever at stopping transmission or spread, they actually may be worse for your health than having no mask at all. Ultimately, I think the science is very clear. There is not enough evidence to support mask mandates as a whole for the community, as there is insufficient evidence to support its effectiveness. On top of that, cloth masks are wildly ineffective and potentially worse for you than no mask at all, and should be avoided at all costs, despite the boom in their production and the push for their use en masse by quote-unquote public health experts, who, ironically, are entirely denying the actual science and studies that have been done on the subject. With the science out of the way, and I urge everyone to read these medical journal articles in their entirety to show for yourself that nothing has been cherry-picked or misinterpreted, let's get back to the Washington Post fiasco of an article. The article reads, and how many problems did we have at our clinic from that, he asks? 0. Absolutely none. LaTulippe's license to practice medicine has now been suspended. This is absolutely nightmarish and reads almost as satire. LaTulippe's livelihood has been stripped from him over nothing more than challenging the narrative, and we're supposed to simply take that as okay. The article reads further. Explaining the suspension in a written order Friday, the Oregon Medical Board said LaTulippe's disdain for public health measures went far beyond staff going maskless. The Dallas, Oregon-based doctor not only fails to take basic precautions, the board said, but also actively promotes transmission of the virus within the extended community by his poor example. The board alleges that LaTulippe regularly misinforms patients, especially elderly ones and children, with warnings that mask wearing is, quote, very dangerous and can lead to serious health issues. There's 2 points here. First, the fact that they allege the doctor is, quote, actively promoting transmission of the virus is ludicrous. Advocating against masks doesn't equal advocating for the spread of the virus. It also goes to prove my previous point. LaTulippe did nothing more than advocate against mask use to his patients and in his practice. He didn't promote false cures or unresearched treatments. Ironically, unlike the mainstream media, who continues to push the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines despite not having nearly enough sufficient evidence from trials to back such a statement. The second point here has to do with LaTulippe's, quote, misinformation. That's actually accurate information that he's alleged to have been spreading to his patients. LaTulippe says mask wearing is, quote, very dangerous and can lead to serious health issues. Well, he's not wrong. New York Post reported back in May that 2 boys in China dropped dead while wearing a mask in gym class. NHK Japan reported back in August that face coverings can improve a person's risk of heat stroke substantially, even reporting that the elderly should, quote, take extra precautions against heat stroke and advises such people to periodically take off their masks and rest in less crowded areas while outdoors, end quote. And to further call back to the scientific consensus, cloth mask use in particular is, as we now know, worse off for you than no mask at all. All of which goes to prove that LaTulippe wasn't spreading misinformation, only reporting the facts to his patients. The article goes on. LaTulippe's conduct is, quote, contrary to medical ethics and does or might constitute a danger to the health or safety of the public. The board's suspension order states it accuses him of gross negligence. The implication here is that not adhering to mask orders and asking patients to question their efficacy and to refuse compliance to said order is dangerous or negligent. Not only does this seek to demonize any questioning of the official narrative, but it also implies that mask use, 1, has no negative effects, and 2, is necessary in stopping the spread of the virus, and in critiquing the mask mandate and mask use in general, you're promoting the spread of the virus, which are all patently false and slippery slopes to more dangerous forms of thought policing that we see in contemporary police forces, even in the Western world. The article reads on. The state board's catalog of concerns begins with LaTulippe's alleged July advice to a patient. According to the board, LaTulippe told the patient that wearing masks does not prevent the spread of the coronavirus and instructed against isolating, because exposure to other people would give the patient immunity to COVID-19. Not only is LaTulippe's advice on masks and immunity accurate to the scientific consensus, but if the patients were healthy, which of course we get zero information about, then the advice relating to exposure would be useful to the vast majority of healthy and active individuals. To paint LaTulippe, who is a medical professional who spent his life dedicated to the medical field, as some unintelligent, irresponsible, and negligent villain successful at spreading COVID-19 is just flat out wrong, on a journalistic and general informational level. The implications of such a portrayal also extend to the effect of pure thought police. Anyone who questions the narrative, whether from research, experience, or both in the case of a medical professional, will be silenced and have their livelihood stripped away from them at the whim of the Ministry of Truth, aka the State Medical Board. The article continues. The person was terminated as a patient a few weeks later, the board says, after questioning LaTulippe's advice. I'm not well equipped enough to give comment on the necessity of patient termination, but just from the information we're being fed, I will say that terminating a patient simply for disagreeing with recommendations seems counterproductive to the entire movement being pushed. Unless the patient was incessantly contrarian for no point other than to defend the mainstream narrative, then there shouldn't have been a reason for termination. Rather, LaTulippe or fellow staff should have directed the patient to more informative information on the subject to come to a more nuanced conclusion. The article reads further. LaTulippe also urged people entering his clinic to remove their masks, according to the state board, and directed people to a YouTube video with misinformation. The board dismisses the doctor's reported claims that masks will harm people by increasing their levels of carbon dioxide. Quote, "The amount of carbon dioxide rebreathed within a mask is trivial," end quote. The order for license suspension states. While questionable as to how negative the effects of rebreathed carbon dioxide via masks are to humans, the general consensus is that it is occurring. To call the broad statement of rebreathing carbon dioxide via prolonged mask use will cause harm as, quote, misinformation, is to further attempt to silence any further information about the general use of masks. It is known that masks are causing headaches in some users after prolonged use, whether cloth, surgical, or N95. To immediately dismiss those instances of negative occurrences as misinformation and to not even be allowed to look into the topic further is ludicrous, and shows us exactly where modern journalism, media, and mainstream thought have been leading us. The article reads further. A board investigator who visited LaTulippe's clinic Wednesday found not only a lack of masks, but also no coronavirus screening measures such as temperature taking and no hand sanitizer in the waiting area, according to the order. A notice told visitors about carbon dioxide toxicity, quote, warning signs, it says. Now, I would love to see the warning signs listed at the office, but regardless, seeing as we know the deadliness of COVID-19, I don't see an issue in the lack of screening measures. Plus, it's not like doctors' offices aren't already strict in their cleaning regimen. To say that this is somehow abnormally irresponsible for a doctor's office simply because of the existence of COVID-19 is yet another example of the level of fear that the media is trying to pump into the public consciousness. That this virus is so dangerous and deadly that everyone must change their entire practice based around it. The article goes on. Many scientific studies, to which they link one, have found that new infections fell notably after leaders instructed people to consistently wear masks. Robert Redfield, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, testified before the Senate in September that masks are, quote, the most important, powerful public health tool we have, end quote, for combating the pandemic. This is a blatant lie. According to a recent article published by Colleen Huber analyzing the data from PCR tests and mask compliance in states most compliant with mask mandates, as opposed to states that lacked compliance, there was no significant evidence supporting the claim that mask use stopped or slowed the spread of COVID-19. On top of that, trusting Robert Redfield, the man known for faking data during the AIDS epidemic back in the 90s, and a laughingstock of the scientific community for his continuous failure to present data during his years in HIV/AIDS research, even Redfield's most milquetoast controversies published to the Wikipedia article show that he's not to be trusted as a member of public health, especially amid an epidemic or pandemic. In reference to the study mentioned in the article, it was a CDC trial that observed mask use on the USS Roosevelt, which even in and of itself went in on a faulty premise, claiming that mask use was used to stop droplets and that COVID-19 is spread via droplets. We know that this is false. COVID-19 is, in fact, spread via aerosolized particles as small as 0.05 microns, small enough to pass through mask filtration. The apt analogy being a fly through a chain link fence, as some have put it. The article continues. LaTulippe has defended his positions in public, telling NBC News in a recent interview that he believes there is, quote, bad science behind mask-wearing recommendations. Speaking at last month's Salem gathering of Trump supporters, who had rallied around false claims of a stolen election, LaTulippe said he wants to expose coronamania and claim that coronavirus has, quote, been with us forever. Whether or not COVID-19 specifically has been with us for longer than the media claims is up for debate. Sewage samples from as far back as March of 2019 tested positive for the virus in Spain. Other studies purporting that the virus was spreading around Italy as early as September of 2019, long before the Wuhan spread incident in China, as well as reports of COVID-19 spreading around the U.S. in early December of 2019. What is true is that coronaviruses have been infecting humans since germ theory was ever even thought up by Louis Pasteur. The common cold is considered a coronavirus, and that has been spreading for at least the last 200 years. As for LaTulippe's comment on bad science, he's right. Bad science and misinformation has been deployed as a way to keep mask use normalized and accepted since the beginning of the outbreak. Ever remember why the WHO and CDC recommended avoiding mask usage, then flipped the script a month later to mandate it across the country? Ever wonder why the virus was confirmed to spread via aerosolized particles, to which the CDC then walked back on that claim and said that it spread via droplets? Ever wonder why the WHO spokesperson came out exposing the asymptomatic myth, to which those statements were later walked back, even though the science didn't change? This is because bad science, as it were, or truly misinformation, or as it was called before the tech age, lies and propaganda, is being deployed as a means to their end, coercing everyone to comply with their orders of mask use and ultimately submitting to any and all wills promoted by quote-unquote public health officials. The article continues. He is not the only healthcare worker to face repercussions for a dismissive attitude towards the virus and public health precautions. This is a quick comment to get the reader to simply accept the totalitarian attitude coming from quote-unquote public health officials. If you do not comply, your livelihood will be stripped. It's ironic. Science has always been based on challenging the narrative and asking questions that come to conclusions often not first thought possible or true. Even germ theory itself was considered quackery, crazy talk throughout the 19th century, and that was after Pasteur proposed his theory. Sadly, the modern-day quote-unquote science that we know has become pandering to the narrative and never changing or questioning it, for fear of losing your positions in society and even livelihood. The article finalizes with this line. An Oregon nurse was put on administrative leave last month after bragging on TikTok about not wearing a mask outside work. With the online backlash mounting, Salem Health said in a statement that the nurse, quote, displayed cavalier disregard for the seriousness of this pandemic and her indifference towards physical distancing and masking out of work, end quote. Truly totalitarian. The government will get involved even in your personal life to take away what keeps food on the table, all just to push a narrative and to show the force they may employ at any time. Ultimately, it seems the government has been successful in its plan to get America to submit entirely to its orders, even contrary to its own published scientific consensus. Whether it's the insufficient evidence supporting the mask mandates and their effectiveness, the inefficiencies of cloth mask use and even their harms, or even the efficacy of vaccines that haven't even completed their phase 3 trials, let alone done proper safety experimentation on, it's clear they do not care. Their goal is submission and compliance with their orders regardless of what science says. For LaTulippe, that meant his livelihood. For the rest of us, it could mean our jobs, our contact with our parents and grandparents, our schooling, or worse. Reading the comments on this article were shocking and honestly saddening. Many of the comments not only agree with the decision, but also call for others to have the same measure taken against them, celebrating this man having his livelihood stripped as if he's some evil supervillain in a sci-fi comic book story, not a real person with a wife and kids to feed. To understand where this is going, the virus ends when we realize that the virus is never ending. Paradoxical almost, but it's true. The media and government, as well as multinationals and NGOs, as they've shown, clearly don't want the virus to ever cease to exist, or at the very least to ever clear up. It's our job to realize that the very little risk involved with going out and seeing our families and friends in a normal pre-COVID-19 manner is enough for us to live with and move on from, as opposed to the pure fear being instilled in the common man when it comes to such an idea of returning to normal. When you let fear control you, and not even your own personal fears, but ones pushed upon you by your TV, cell phone, or local representative, then you let yourself become a shell of what you once were, a normal, bright, and functioning person. The appeal to authority that has fallen upon us that just says, blindly trust whatever this person in a position of authority says, is scary. Whereas only a decade back, the distrust in authority and government was at the very least a healthy amount where one could make their own decisions outside of scrutiny from the power structure. Now it has become a world in which one cannot and will not question authority nor make his own decisions, for he is not apt or gifted of the knowledge from those who we say have the knowledge. It's antithetical to human nature, and we've been conditioned to accept it as a fact of life. That those on TV in fancy suits are correct, and you cannot be correct, no matter how much research, critical thinking, and questioning you do. Even if you, ironically, read the actual quote-unquote science that we're supposedly supposed to be following. Follow the science, except when it disagrees with our narrative, as it were. All in all, non-compliance is the only way we make this go away, and it's something so simple anyone can do it. Stop wearing a mask, especially if it's cloth, if anything, and continue spreading the word by action. The more non-mask people we see, the better we're doing as a whole. It's our civic duty to fight for liberty, and, at the very least, now you've been informed enough on the actual scientific consensus in published medical journals to maybe spread the word against those simply pushing narratives without doing any research on the topic themselves. Take off the mask, if not for liberty, at least for your own well-being and safety.